A crying pup grabbed the Alpha King's cloak. "They're injuring my mom," and he lost control. The crowd parted, the way water parts for a stone dropped from a great height. Fast, instinctive, without any choice in the matter. Alpha King Darien Voss moved through the open courtyard of the Ashvale Pack territory, with the kind of presence that made every wolf in the vicinity straighten their spine, without even realizing they had done it. He was not the tallest man in the gathering, nor the loudest. He never needed to be loud. His silence was enough. His very stillness carried a weight that pressed down on the air around him, and every wolf with even a trace of instinct felt it in their bones the moment he arrived. The annual assembly had drawn hundreds of wolves from across every territory under his rule. They came because they had to. There was no such thing as an optional appearance when the Alpha King called a gathering. Families stood in rows. Pack leaders arranged themselves in careful order of rank, their chests puffed, their expressions controlled. Even the most arrogant of the high-ranking wolves kept their eyes slightly lowered when Darien passed. Not from weakness, from wisdom. There was a difference between courage and foolishness, and every wolf in that courtyard knew exactly which side of that line standing tall in front of Darien Voss fell on. His cloak was the color of a sky just before a storm, so dark it swallowed light. It moved behind him as he walked, heavy and deliberate, and the sound of his boots on the stone ground was the only steady rhythm in an otherwise breathless crowd. His guards flanked him in 2 columns, dressed in the silver and black of the royal pack, their faces blank and professional. They had been trained not to react to anything. They had been trained to anticipate, to intercept, to prevent. They were, by every measure, among the most capable wolves in the kingdom. None of them anticipated what happened next. Darien had reached the center of the courtyard, where the assembly traditionally began with a formal address from the king to the gathered packs, when something small and firm caught the edge of his cloak and pulled. Not a tug, not an accidental brush, a deliberate, desperate grip, the kind that comes from someone who has made a decision that cost them everything just to make it. He stopped. That alone was remarkable. Darien Voss did not stop for anything that was not his own decision. But the grip on his cloak was so unexpected, so completely outside the ordered world that surrounded him, that his body responded before his mind had fully processed what was happening. He turned, slowly, the way a man turns when he is already certain of something and just needs his eyes to confirm it. A child stood behind him. A boy, small enough that the top of his head barely reached the bottom of Darien's chest. His feet were bare on the cold stone, and the skin of his toes was reddened from the chill of the ground. His clothes were worn and plain, the kind that had been washed so many times the color had bled out of them, and left behind only a pale, tired gray. His face was streaked with the tracks of tears that had already dried, and new ones were forming at the corners of his eyes, as Darien looked down at him. His lower lip was not trembling the way a frightened child's lip might tremble. It was pressed together, firm and determined, as if he had decided he was not going to let it shake no matter what. He was holding Darien's cloak with both hands. His knuckles were pale from the strength of his grip. Every guard had moved the moment the child made contact. 2 of them were already reaching forward, ready to remove the boy firmly, but efficiently. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a speaker. The cold, electric silence of people witnessing something that had never happened before and had no category in their experience. Darien raised one hand. His guards stopped. He looked at the boy for a long moment. The child looked back at him. There were no words for the first several seconds. Just 2 pairs of eyes, one pair dark and unreadable, belonging to the most powerful wolf in the known territories, and one pair wide and red-rimmed and raw, with a kind of pain that had no sophistication to it, no politics, no calculation, just pure, unfiltered desperation. "They're hurting my mom," the boy said. His voice was quiet. It did not carry far. Most of the crowd could not hear him, but Darien heard every word, and something in the quality of the boy's voice, not crying, not screaming, just saying it the way you say a thing when you have run out of every other option and truth is the only thing you have left, made him stay very still. "Please," the boy added, "you have to stop them." Darien looked at the child's hands, still wrapped tight around his cloak. Then he looked at the boy's face again. Then he did something that would be talked about in every pack in the kingdom before the next sunrise. He crouched down, slowly, until he was at eye level with the child. "What is your name?" he asked. The boy blinked. He had clearly not expected that question. He had expected to be removed. He had expected to be ignored, or scolded, or handed off to someone who would make him go away. He had not expected the Alpha King to kneel in front of him and ask his name. "Eli," the boy said. "Eli," Darian repeated. His voice was not gentle, the way a kind man's voice is gentle. It was careful, measured, the way a man speaks when he is choosing every word precisely. "Where is your mother?" Eli's grip on the cloak tightened, and then, as if he had just realized that the man he had grabbed was actually listening, his composure broke just slightly. Not much. Just enough for one more tear to slide down his cheek. "She's in the lower quarter," he said. "By the river fence. They've been hurting her for a long time, and nobody stops them. And I didn't know what else to do." Darian looked at him for one more moment. Then he straightened up. He did not look at his guards. He did not consult anyone. He did not call for a report or ask for verification or do any of the 50 things a leader of his status would normally do before acting on the words of an unknown child at a public gathering. He simply said, "Take me there." And Eli, who had run barefoot across 3/4 of the assembly grounds with his heart hammering so hard he had thought it might stop, exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. He turned and began to walk, and the Alpha King walked beside him, and the crowd split apart before them both. The lower quarter of the Ashvale territory was not a place that received much attention from the upper ranks. It sat below the ridge that divided the main settlement from the older, rougher edges of the packlands, pressed up against the curve of the river where the wind came off the water cold and damp in every season. The homes there were functional. They kept the rain out. They held warmth if you built the fire high enough. They were not the kind of homes that the pack leaders pointed to when they wanted to show visitors how prosperous their territory was. The people who lived there were not the kind of wolves that the pack leaders pointed to either. Omegas occupied the lowest rung of the pack hierarchy, and in practice, that meant they were the last to eat, the last to receive any form of support or resources, and the first to be handed responsibilities that no one else wanted. They cleaned, they cooked, they repaired, they fetched. They did what they were told by anyone whose rank exceeded theirs, which was almost everyone. In exchange, they were given a place to sleep and just enough food to keep them standing. Sarah had lived in the lower quarter for 3 years. Before that, she had lived there with her mate, Callum, a low-ranking warrior who had been assigned to the Eastern Border Patrol. Callum had been a quiet man, not exciting or powerful or particularly clever, but steady and honest, and good in the small, daily ways that matter more than most people admit. He had come home every evening smelling of forest and cold air, and he had always asked about her day before he talked about his own. When Eli was born, Callum had sat outside the door of the birthing room all night, because the midwife would not let him in, and in the morning, when Sarah emerged exhausted and proud with a small, dark-haired bundle in her arms, Callum had cried. He had tried to hide it. He was not very successful. He died on the eastern border in a skirmish that lasted less than 4 minutes. A rogue had come through the fence line during a patrol gap, and Callum had been the one standing in the way. The official account described it as a brave and necessary sacrifice. The pack gave Sarah a single formal acknowledgement of his service. After that, she was on her own. Without a mate's income or rank, Sarah fell to Omega status almost immediately. The pack provided the minimum required by law, a roof and a weekly food distribution. Everything else she had to earn through work, and the work available to an unmated Omega in the lower quarter was the worst kind. She carried loads, she hauled water, she cleaned the common spaces of the upper quarter at hours when no one of rank would have to see her doing it. She did it without complaint, because complaint was not an option. She did it because Eli needed to eat. For a while, it was survivable. Hard, but survivable. The pack members in the lower quarter were, by and large, not unkind. They were tired and stretched thin themselves, and there was a kind of solidarity in shared difficulty. People shared bread when they had extra. They watched each other's children when one mother had to work a double shift. They did not talk much about the unfairness of the system, because talking about it did nothing, and silence at least preserved energy. The trouble came in the form of 3 wolves from the mid-ranking tier of the pack. Their names were Grant Hollis, Pete Corden, and a man who went only by his pack nickname, Barrel, on account of his build. They were not high-ranked enough to have real power, which made them more dangerous in certain ways than wolves who were. Men with real power have something to lose. Men with just enough rank to feel entitled, but not enough to be accountable to anything meaningful, will use that small amount of power in every way available to them. They had decided, some months ago, that the lower quarter was their territory, to do with as they pleased during the off hours, when the upper ranks were not watching. They helped themselves to extra food allocations that were meant for Omega families. They demanded small services, errands, labor, the fetching and carrying of things they were perfectly capable of carrying themselves, from anyone they could pressure into compliance. And when someone did not comply fast enough, or when they were simply in a bad mood, they expressed that displeasure physically. Sarah had been on their list for a long time. She was unmated, unprotected, and she had made the mistake, early on, of refusing to give up Eli's weekly bread allocation when Beryl demanded it. She had said no, not loudly, not with any kind of dramatic speech, just a flat, quiet no, and she had held the bread against her chest and looked at him without flinching. He had not forgotten it. Since then, the three of them had found reasons to make her life harder at every opportunity. They reported her for minor infractions that resulted in docked work hours. They knocked over the water containers she carried up from the river, requiring her to go back down and fill them again. And on nights when the quarter was quiet and the upper pack was occupied with its own affairs, they came to her home, and they were not careful about whether Eli could hear them through the thin walls. The night of the annual assembly, Sarah had thought she might have a few hours of peace. The three men had been required to attend the gathering, same as everyone else. She had put Eli to bed early, eaten the last of her bread standing at the window, and let herself feel, just for a moment, the particular exhaustion that comes not from one hard day, but from a long string of them stacked up so high, you cannot see over them anymore. She did not hear them come back. She only knew they were there when the door opened without a knock. Eli had not been asleep. He had been lying very still, the way children do when they are listening to something that frightens them, and they do not want the adults to know they are frightened. He heard his mother's voice go tight and careful, the way it always did when those men came. He heard the sounds that followed. He lay still for as long as he could, which was not very long, because he was 5 years old, and his mother was on the other side of a thin wall, and there was nothing inside him that was capable of staying still when she was in danger. He slipped out through the back window. He did not have shoes. He did not have a plan. He only knew that the biggest, most powerful person he had ever heard of was somewhere on the other side of the quarter, and if anyone could stop what was happening to his mother, it was that person. So he ran. He had never seen the Alpha King before. He had only heard the name spoken in the tones that adults use for things they consider to be both very important and very far away, like storms on the horizon. The Alpha King was real, in the way that a mountain is real. You know it exists. You know it is enormous. You know it could crush you without noticing. But Eli did not think about any of that. He thought about his mother's voice, and the sounds through the wall, and his feet hitting the cold ground, and the lights of the assembly up on the high end of the quarter, getting closer and closer. He saw the crowd first. Then he saw the guards, silver and black, creating a moving wall around a single figure. He did not know how he knew which man was the king. He just knew. The same way you know a fire is hot before you touch it. Something in the way the crowd behaved, the way the air moved differently around him, told Eli exactly who he was looking for. He ran for the edge of the crowd. A woman tried to catch him, alarmed by a barefoot child charging through the assembly. He ducked under her arm. A guard saw him and stepped forward. He went sideways. He moved the way only very small, very determined children can move, too low to grab easily, and too fast to predict. He reached the edge of the cloak. He grabbed it with both hands, and he held on. Now, as Eli led the Alpha King and his column of guards down through the lower quarter toward the river fence, the boy's feet were cold, and his chest was tight, with fear of a different kind. Not fear for himself, but the consuming, breathless fear of arriving too late. He walked as fast as his legs could carry him, and did not look back to check if Darian was still following, because some part of him understood, in the wordless way that children sometimes understand important things, that the Alpha King did not need to be checked on. He was there. The ground said so. The air said so. Everything said so. They came around the bend of the path that curved down toward the river fence, and Eli heard his mother's voice, and he stopped walking so abruptly that he nearly fell forward. Then he started running. Darian matched his pace without a word. The scene in front of the small house near the river fence stopped everyone in the group cold. Everyone except Eli, who did not stop at all, and ran straight to his mother, and dropped to his knees beside her, and put his arms around her, and said nothing, just held on. And she held on too. Darian looked at what was in front of him. He did not need long to understand it. He was a man who had seen the aftermath of many things. He recognized what he was looking at. 3 men stood in a loose cluster near the doorway of the house. They had not expected to be interrupted. The surprise on their faces shifted rapidly when they registered the silver and black of the Royal Guard and the figure behind them. Grant Hollis paled. Pete Corden took a step back. Beryl, the largest of the 3, held still, which was perhaps the least intelligent decision any of the 3 made that night. Darian did not shout. He did not warn them twice. He did not speak in the formal language of pack law or quote the statutes that governed the treatment of Omega-ranked wolves, though he knew them all precisely. He spoke in the flat, quiet voice of a man who has already made every decision that needs to be made and is simply announcing the outcome. "Take them," he said. His guards moved. Within 60 seconds, all 3 men were secured. Within 3 minutes, they had been removed from the lower quarter entirely. Within the hour, the Ashvale pack leader had been summoned from the assembly and was standing in front of the Alpha King with the expression of a man who very much wished he were somewhere else, explaining, in a voice that cracked twice, how this had been allowed to happen in his territory. Darian listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He let the pack leader talk himself into a smaller and smaller corner. Then he gave his judgment, and it was comprehensive, and it was final, and no one in earshot made the mistake of thinking it was open to discussion. But before any of that, before the pack leader was summoned, before the formal proceedings began, before a single word of official language was spoken, Darian Voss did something that his guards would remember for the rest of their careers. He crouched down again, the way he had crouched in the courtyard, and he looked at Eli, who was still holding his mother's hand, and looking up at him, with eyes that were exhausted and scared, and, underneath all of that, fiercely and utterly determined. "Is she going to be all right?" Darian asked. Eli looked at his mother. Sarah looked at the Alpha King. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She will be," Eli said finally. "She always is." Darian looked at Sarah then, just for a moment. She was sitting very straight, even now, with dried tracks of pain on her face, and her jaw set like something carved. She met his eyes and did not look away. There was no gratitude in her expression yet, and no fear. Just the quiet, guarded assessment of a woman who had learned, through long experience, that the arrival of powerful people did not automatically mean the beginning of safety. He did not say anything to her in that moment. There was nothing that needed to be said yet. He straightened up, turned back to his guards, and began the business of consequences. But the question stayed with him longer than he expected. Not the answer. The question itself. He had asked it before he thought about it, which was unusual. Darian Voss was a man who thought before he did everything. He had trained himself into it over years, over grief, over the particular kind of discipline that loss teaches better than any teacher can. He had asked because he wanted to know, and he had wanted to know because somewhere in the space between the courtyard and the river fence, something had shifted in him that he did not yet have a name for. He filed it away, the way he filed everything that he did not understand immediately. He would deal with it later. For now, there was work to do. The morning that followed, the night of the assembly, moved through the Ashvale pack territory, the way mornings move through places where something significant has changed, slowly, with people stepping carefully, testing the new ground before they put their full weight on it. The sun came up orange and thin, throwing long shadows across the stone paths of the lower quarter, and the families who lived there woke to a silence that felt different from yesterday's silence. Quieter, cleaner, as if the air itself had been rinsed overnight. Word moved fast in a pack, always. It was one of the fundamental features of communities that lived close together and shared resources and history. By the time the sun had cleared the ridge, most of the lower quarter knew what had happened. By the time it reached midpoint in the sky, the upper quarter knew too. By the time the assembly formally concluded and the gathered wolves from other territories began making their way home, it had spread to 3 neighboring packs and was moving outward from there. The story changed with each telling, as stories always do. In some versions, Eli had climbed the Alpha King's back. In others, he had screamed. In the most dramatic account, which originated somewhere in the mid-ranking housing blocks and gained a great deal of momentum. The child had thrown himself into the Alpha King's path and refused to move until his demands were met. None of these versions were accurate, but the core of it, the barefoot boy, the grabbed cloak, the 4 words that had made the most powerful wolf in the kingdom stop walking, that part stayed true in every version, because that part was the kind of thing that does not need embellishment. What people argued about was the meaning. Some said it was exactly what it looked like, a leader doing his job, enforcing pack law, protecting the people under his rule. Nothing more, nothing less. A clean and simple exercise of authority that happened to be triggered by an unusual set of circumstances. The Alpha King had acted. The wrongdoers had been punished. The system had functioned as intended. This was the position of those who preferred their understanding of events to fit neatly into existing categories. Others were less comfortable with that explanation, because if it was simply a matter of enforcing pack law, there were channels for that. There were complaint processes. There were pack wardens whose specific job was to receive reports from Omega-ranked wolves and investigate them through proper procedure. Those processes were slow and imperfect, and widely known to favor those with enough rank to make their version of events stick. But they existed. The Alpha King did not need to personally follow a barefoot child through the lower quarter. He did not need to crouch at a child's level and ask the child's name. He did not need to do any of what he had done in the particular way he had done it. He had done it anyway. In his own quarters, far from the gossip of the Ashvale territory, Darian sat at a desk that was rarely used for anything other than work, and read through the initial report his senior guard, a sharp-eyed man named Colin, had compiled overnight about the 3 wolves now in custody. The report was thorough. It outlined the extent of their activities in the lower quarter over the past several months, the number of families affected, the complaints that had been filed and subsequently buried, and the degree to which the Ashvale pack leader had either failed to notice or chosen not to notice what was happening in his own territory. Darian read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a while. He had ruled for 9 years. He had taken the throne at the age of 24, which was young for an Alpha King, young enough that the older pack leaders had looked at him with thinly disguised evaluation in those early years, calculating whether he would hold. He had held through a border dispute with the northern packs that had nearly become a war. He had held through a drought that killed 2 full seasons of crops in the Central Territories and required the kind of resource management that made enemies of people you needed to keep as allies. He had held through the loss of his mate, Helena, in the 4th year of his reign, which had nearly broken him in ways that none of the political crises had come close to. Helena had been the only person, in his adult life, who had ever made him feel that the version of himself that existed when no one was watching was worth something. She had been direct and brave and quietly funny, in a way that only people who knew her well ever got to see. She had not been intimidated by his position, which was rare. She had argued with him when she thought he was wrong, which was also rare, and she had usually been correct, which he had found irritating until he did not anymore. She was gone, and the grief of that was not the sharp, cutting kind anymore. It had settled into something duller and more permanent, a weight that he had learned to carry without showing that he was carrying it. He had rebuilt himself around its edges, carefully, the way you repair a wall around a foundation that is cracked. The wall held. It was, in most respects, stronger than the original. But walls do not hold everything out equally. A wall that keeps armies out will not necessarily keep out a small hand on the hem of a cloak. He picked up the report again. Eli had spent the night in the infirmary adjoining the Alpha King's temporary quarters in the Ashvale guest house. This was not something Darian had formally arranged. It had been his guard captain, a practical woman named Nora, who had made the decision after observing that the boy had a slight fever from running barefoot through the cold for an extended period, and that his mother was receiving medical attention in the adjoining room, and that separating them would create more problems than it solved. Darian had been informed of this arrangement after the fact, and he had nodded without comment, which was as close to approval as things usually got with him. He had walked past the infirmary twice during the night, for reasons he did not examine too closely. Now, reading Colin's report in the gray morning light, he found his mind returning to Eli's face, to the deliberateness of that grip on his cloak, to the way the boy had spoken, not with the hysteria of a frightened child, but with the stripped-down clarity of someone who had thought through their options and chosen the most direct remaining one. He also found himself thinking about what Eli had said at the end, when Darian had asked if his mother would be all right. She always is. There was pride in that, and certainty, and a kind of love that was not simple. It was the love of a child who has watched someone he depends on face very difficult things and remain standing. A child who has learned, earlier than he should have, that the person he loves is strong enough to endure things that should not have to be endured. Darian did not allow himself to think about that connection for long. It was the kind of thought that went places he had chosen not to visit. He returned to the report. By mid-morning, he had made 4 formal decisions. The first concerned the 3 men in custody. Their punishment would be handled by royal law, not Ashvale Pack law, which had clearly demonstrated its limitations in this matter. The second concerned the Ashvale Pack leader, who would receive a formal censure and undergo an administrative review of his pack's welfare systems before any future assembly invitation was extended. The third concerned the complaint processes for Omega-ranked wolves across all territories. They would be reviewed, and Colin would head the review. The fourth concerned Sarah and Eli. He did not think of this decision in terms of what it cost him. It was straightforward, as far as he was concerned. A woman and her child in the lower quarter of a pack, whose leader had just been censured for inadequate oversight, were not going to be safe there in the immediate aftermath of what had happened the night before. Resentment was predictable. Vulnerability was obvious. Moving them was simply the logical step. When Colin brought the decision document for his signature, the guard captain raised one eyebrow, a significant expression from a woman whose face generally moved very little, at the section that specified the relocation would be to the protected housing district adjacent to the royal grounds. "Is there a question?" Darian said, without looking up from the document. "No, sir," Colin said. He signed it. Sarah was awake when Nora came to her with the news. She was sitting on the edge of the narrow infirmary bed, with her hands folded in her lap, and Eli was beside her, leaning against her arm, half asleep, his feet, now clean and wrapped in borrowed wool socks, dangling above the floor. She had been awake for most of the night, not from pain, though the pain was real, from habit. She had not been able to simply stop watching the door. Nora was a straightforward person, and she explained the situation straightforwardly. Relocation, protected housing, transportation arranged for that afternoon. No action required on Sarah's part, except to accept. Sarah listened to all of it. Then she said, "Why?" Nora looked at her evenly. "The Alpha King's decision." "I understand that," Sarah said. "I'm asking why." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I don't have the answer to that. I can ask on your behalf if you'd like." Sarah thought about it. "No," she said finally. "I'll manage." She looked down at Eli, who had fallen fully asleep against her arm, his mouth slightly open, his face loose and unguarded in the way of children who have spent everything they had and finally allowed themselves to rest. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, more to herself than to anyone in the room, "He really went." Nora did not ask what she meant. She did not need to. Eli had gone, barefoot and alone, across 3/4 of the assembly grounds in the dark, and he had grabbed the Alpha King's cloak, and he had said what needed to be said, and the Alpha King had come. Sarah had not known any of this until afterward, until her son was beside her again, and the men were gone, and a guard was telling her what had happened. She had listened with a still face and steady eyes, because she was very good at still faces and steady eyes. She had learned that composure was the only asset that could not be taken from her. But inside that composure, something had shaken loose. The image of Eli running barefoot in the dark to find help for her. The image of that small hand on that dark cloak. The image of the Alpha King, crouching down to look her son in the eye and asking his name, as if the name of a barefoot Omega child at a public gathering was a thing worth knowing. She was not naive. She did not believe that one night of intervention had changed the world. She did not believe that a powerful man's brief attention was a guarantee of anything. She had learned, in the years since Callum's passing, to be very precise about what she allowed herself to believe in, because believing in the wrong things was more expensive than not believing in anything. But something had cracked open in the careful wall she maintained, and she did not have the time or the energy right now to repair it. She could only sit with Eli asleep against her arm, and the thin morning light coming through the infirmary window, and the knowledge that today was different from yesterday, somehow. in ways she could not yet fully measure. The transport came in the afternoon. It was clean and covered, far better than anything Sarah had ridden in before, and Eli pressed his face against the gap in the covering and watched the Ashvale territory recede behind them, with the focused attention of a child cataloging a world that is changing faster than he can keep up with. He had asked 6 questions in the first 10 minutes of the journey, which covered, in order, where they were going, whether the Alpha King would be there, whether there would be food, whether he could have a dog, and whether the Alpha King had a dog. Sarah had answered the first and third with honesty, the second with careful uncertainty, and the fourth and fifth with the practiced patience of a mother who has learned that some questions require more than one response across a longer period of time. She watched the territory pass outside the transport and kept her hands folded and her breathing even, and she thought about the question she had asked Nora. Why? She did not have an answer. She was not sure the Alpha King had one either, if the reports she was now hearing from the guard who accompanied them were any indication. Apparently, the man had stood in the Ashvale courtyard with a 5-year-old's hands on his cloak and had simply followed. No calculation, no consultation, no protocol. Just a turn, and a question, and an action. That was not the behavior of a man operating from strategy. That was the behavior of a man who had been caught off guard by something real. Sarah filed this information away the same way she filed everything, carefully, without drawing conclusions too fast, without building structures on uncertain ground. She would watch. She would pay attention. She would not decide what to think until she had more information. She was very good at waiting. Eli, who had no interest whatsoever in waiting, pressed his face harder against the transport gap and said, "I think we're going somewhere important." "We are," Sarah said. "Good," he said, and he sounded completely satisfied with that, as if important was all he had ever needed them to be headed toward. She almost smiled. She caught it before it fully arrived, the way she usually caught things before they fully arrived. But it was close. It was closer than most things had been in a long time. The transport rolled on, and the road ahead was new, and the morning had not finished deciding what it was going to be yet. Darian Voss had not laughed in 4 years. He had smiled occasionally, controlled, brief, purposeful expressions deployed during diplomatic functions when the situation required a human face rather than an authoritative one. Those smiles were not real, in the way the word real implies. They were tools, like everything else he deployed in the management of the kingdom. He did not resent having learned to use them. He understood their function. But genuine laughter, the unplanned, unguarded kind that comes out of you before you can decide whether to let it, had not happened since before Helena was gone. He had not noticed this absence the same way you do not notice the hum of a machine until it stops. You do not miss what has simply become the background of your life. And once it was gone, there was nothing to remind him of it, because the people around him were careful never to be the kind of people who made the Alpha King laugh without permission. Eli was not that kind of person. He had been in the protected housing district for 10 days when he found the Alpha King's study. This was not an accident in the sense of being unintentional. Eli did not do unintentional things. He had, over the course of those 10 days, conducted a systematic survey of every corridor and room he was allowed to access in the guest wing of the royal grounds, and then he had tested the boundaries of allowed with the methodical patience of a child who understands that boundaries are primarily suggestions until proven otherwise. He had met Nora 3 times. He had asked her, in order, whether there were any wolves on the grounds who were his age, whether there was a library, and whether the Alpha King was nearby or far away. Nora had answered the first question with regret, the second with directions, and the third by not answering at all, which Eli correctly interpreted as confirmation. The study door was large and dark and not locked. Eli had stood in front of it for a while, not from nervousness but from a kind of assessment. He was a thoughtful child, and he was deciding whether the moment was right. Then he knocked. 3 times. Firm and even. There was a pause. "Come in," said a voice that Eli recognized. He pushed the door open and walked in, and stood in the middle of the room and looked at Darian, who was sitting behind a desk covered in documents, and looking back at him, with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was also not entirely the absence of it. "Hello," Eli said. "Hello," Darian said. A silence followed that was not uncomfortable in the way silences usually are between people of very different power. It was more like the silence between two people who are each trying to figure out what the other one is. "Are you busy?" Eli asked. Darian looked at the documents in front of him. "Yes." "All right," Eli said. He did not leave. He looked around the room with bright, interested eyes, taking inventory. The books on the shelves, the map on the wall, the fireplace, the narrow window that looked out onto the training grounds below. Darian watched him. "Did you want something?" Eli turned back to look at him. "I wanted to say thank you. My mother told me to. But I wanted to anyway. Which is different." Something in Darian's expression shifted very slightly. "Is it?" "Yes," Eli said, with conviction. "When you say thank you, because someone tells you to, it's a politeness. When you say it because you want to, it's real." He paused. "She's teaching me the difference." Darian was quiet for a moment. "Your mother sounds like a careful teacher." "She's careful about everything," Eli said, without any judgment in it, just observation. "She thinks a lot before she does things. She says it's better to be slow and right than fast and wrong." He tilted his head slightly. "You went very fast when you came to help us." It was not a challenge. It was genuine curiosity, the kind that only children and very confident adults permit themselves. The observation landed in the room with the simple weight of something true, and Darian did not have an immediate answer for it, which was an experience he was not particularly familiar with. "Sit down if you want," he said. Eli looked at the chairs. He chose the one closest to the fireplace because the day was cold and his feet were still learning to stay warm. He sat with his hands on his knees, completely at ease, and looked at Darian with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child who does not understand why looking directly at someone should be difficult. This was how it began. Over the following weeks, Eli appeared at the study door with a frequency that Darian's staff found alarming, and that Darian himself did not, which surprised them nearly as much as the visits themselves. The boy came in the mornings, mostly, when the light was good and Darian's early meetings were done. He asked questions. He had a remarkable range of questions, covering subjects that included the history of the pack territories, the reason wolves had two forms, whether it hurt to shift the first time, what the most dangerous animal was that Darian had ever encountered, how maps worked, and whether the Alpha King had any friends. That last question came on a Thursday morning, about 3 weeks after Eli's arrival, and Darian looked up from his reading and held the boy's gaze for a moment before answering. "Several," he said, carefully. "Do they come here?" Eli asked. "Sometimes." "My mother says it's hard to make real friends when you're important," Eli said, with the pleasant frankness of someone reporting a fact. "She says people confuse being useful to someone with caring about them, and it takes time to tell which is which." Darian set down his document. "Your mother says a great many things." "She's smart," Eli said simply. "She knows a lot of things that she doesn't say too, though. You can tell, because she gets a look." He made a face that was clearly an impression of the look, a thoughtful, slightly guarded expression, with the chin lifted just slightly. Darian looked at the impression. Something happened in his chest, not pain, not warmth, but a kind of pressure that was adjacent to both, and before he understood what was happening, a sound came out of him, a short sound, involuntary. He shut it down almost immediately, but not fast enough, because Eli had heard it, and he was looking at Darian now, with the most pleased expression Darian had seen on any face in a very long time. "Was that a laugh?" Eli asked. "No," Darian said. "It sounded like one." "You were mistaken." Eli considered this. "I don't think I was," he said politely. There was a pause. Then, very quietly, a second sound escaped. Longer this time, with a little more breath behind it. Darian pressed one hand flat on the desk in front of him, as if steadying himself against something. His head dropped slightly. When he raised it again, his expression was controlled, but the edges of it were not quite what they usually were. Eli was beaming. "I made you laugh," he announced. "You made a noise come out of me," Darian said. "That is not the same thing." "It is the same thing," Eli said cheerfully. "My mother makes that same noise when she doesn't want me to know something is funny." Darian looked at the boy. He looked at the window. He looked back at the boy. "You're very sure of yourself," he said. My mother says confidence is the thing left over when you've already decided you're not going to pretend, Eli said. He paused. She says you have to decide it every day, though, because pretending is easier. Darian was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the window glass, and somewhere on the training grounds below, someone was calling out drills in a steady, rhythmic voice. "How old are you?" he asked. 5, Eli said, "but I'll be 6 in spring. My mother says spring birthdays are the best, because everything is waking up at the same time." Darian thought about that. "She's right," he said, and he sounded, briefly, like a man who had said a true thing without managing it first. Eli heard this too. He filed it away with the care of a child who notices more than adults expect. After Eli left that morning, bouncing out of the study with the same energy he always arrived with, barefoot, despite the wool socks Nora had provided twice, Darian sat at his desk and did not look at any of the documents in front of him for several minutes. He was thinking about the noise that had come out of him. He was thinking about when he had last made that noise, and what it had meant, and what it meant now. He was also, in a way he did not examine too directly, thinking about the look Eli had described, the one his mother made. He had seen that look, once, in the infirmary doorway. She had been sitting very straight with her hands folded, and she had assessed him the way you assess a structure you are not certain will hold, and she had not hidden the fact that she was doing it. He had found it notable at the time. He found it more notable now, in retrospect. He was not a man who was assessed. He was a man who assessed. The distinction had always been clear and comfortable. He was finding it slightly less comfortable now. In the protected housing wing, Sarah was having a different kind of morning. She had spent the first several days in the new space in a state of careful observation, mapping the routines of the people around her, learning who the guards were and what their patterns meant, understanding what the space required of her, and what it offered in return. She had been given, for the first time in 3 years, a room with a door that locked from the inside, a kitchen with actual food in it, and access to a small courtyard where the morning light came in at an angle that was almost warm. She did not allow herself to feel settled. Settled was a luxury she had learned not to spend on temporary situations, and she did not yet know if this situation was temporary or something else. She was grateful, in the precise and measured way she allowed herself to be grateful for things, aware of the gift, without leaning on it too heavily, because gifts were revocable, and dependence on revocable things was a form of debt she did not want to carry. What she did allow herself was observation. Eli came home from the study that third Thursday, with a particular quality of aliveness to him. It was hard to describe. It was not simply the normal energy of a child who had been someplace interesting. It was the slightly brighter, slightly more vibrant kind that came when something genuinely important had happened. She had been watching him closely enough, for long enough, that she could tell the difference. She did not ask directly. She had learned that direct questions with Eli usually produced summary answers, while quiet observation produced stories. She was right. By the time dinner was done, she knew about the study visit, and the documents, and the map on the wall, and the fireplace, and every question Eli had asked, and the answers he had received. She also knew about the laugh. "He laughed?" she said, keeping her voice neutral, reaching for her water. "He said it wasn't a laugh," Eli said, "but it was." Sarah took a measured sip of water. "What made him laugh?" "I did the look," Eli said. Sarah set down the water. "Which look?" "Yours," Eli said, simply, cheerfully, as if this was completely normal information to share at dinner. Sarah looked at her son. Her son looked back at her with his father's eyes and his own complete confidence. "I see," she said. She did not say anything else about it, but later, when Eli was in bed and the room was quiet, she stood at the locked door of their room and thought about what that meant. A man who had not laughed in 4 years, she had heard this, in the careful way she heard everything that passed through the guest wing corridors, in the way servants talk around guests they think are not listening, had laughed at a child doing an impression of her. She was not sure what to do with that information. She was not sure it meant anything. It was a small thing, the smallest kind of thing, the kind of thing that means nothing, and everything depending on what comes next. She went to bed. She lay in the dark room with the locked door between her and the rest of the world, and she thought about Callum, as she sometimes did, not with the sharp grief of early loss, but with the gentler kind. The kind that comes when you have accepted an absence and learned to live inside the shape it left behind. She thought about what he would say if he could see them here, in a warm room with enough food and a locked door. She thought he would probably just ask if she was all right. She was not entirely sure of the answer yet, but she thought the direction things were moving might be towards something she could call all right, eventually, if she was careful. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind had settled, and the grounds were quiet. And somewhere on the other side of the stone building, in a study filled with documents and firelight, the Alpha King was sitting at a desk and not reading any of the papers in front of him. The gossip had not died down. It had, if anything, deepened and broadened in the weeks following the assembly, taking on new layers as new facts emerged and were absorbed into the ongoing conversation that the Pack territories conducted about themselves and their king. The initial stories, the grabbed cloak, the barefoot child, the 3 men removed from the lower quarter, had been striking enough on their own. But what happened in the days and weeks that followed added dimensions that the original story had not contained. The relocation of an Omega woman and her son to the protected housing district adjacent to the royal grounds was not a secret. Nothing in the Pack territories remained secret for long. The fact that this had been the Alpha King's personal decision, not a council recommendation or a guard protocol, was confirmed by 3 separate sources before the end of the first week, which meant it was reliable information by Pack standards. It moved through the territories with the particular energy of news that feels significant but has not yet revealed why. Then came the stories from people employed at the royal grounds, kitchen staff, cleaning staff, guards on rotation, about the boy who visited the Alpha King's study, about the questions he asked, and the patience with which the Alpha King, reportedly, answered them, about the laugh. This one required more careful handling. It came from a young guard named Pete who had been stationed outside the study door during one of Eli's visits and had heard, very distinctly, the sound of laughter from inside a room that had not previously been known to produce that sound. He mentioned it to a colleague. The colleague mentioned it to 3 other people over supper. By morning, it had reached the servant quarters. By afternoon, it had left the grounds entirely and entered the broader circulation of Pack gossip, where it immediately divided people into 2 camps. The first camp said this was significant. The second camp said it was nothing. The first camp, which included most of the lower-ranked wolves and a fair number of the mid-ranking ones, found the idea of the Alpha King laughing not just notable, but meaningful, in a way they struggled to articulate precisely. Their understanding of Darien Voss was of a man who had made himself into a wall, who had ruled with total competence and near total distance since Helena's passing, who had been so consistently unreadable that the fact of him being moved by anything, let alone a small boy with no shoes on, felt like a signal. A change in weather, a crack in the stone. They did not know what it meant, but they felt it meant something. The second camp, which included most of the high-ranking wolves and all of Darien's council, preferred the interpretation that this was a calculated move, that the Alpha King had identified, in an Omega child's desperate act, an opportunity, a chance to visibly demonstrate concern for the lowest ranks, to generate goodwill among the most numerous and least represented portion of the Pack population, to appear accessible and human in the way that rulers periodically need to appear in order to maintain the kind of loyalty that keeps territories stable. It was smart politics, nothing more. Lord Cassian Voss, the Alpha King's uncle and the most senior member of the High Council, belonged firmly to the second camp. He sat in his quarters on the 4th morning after the assembly and listened to his aide deliver the compiled reports on the situation, with his hands folded in his lap, and his expression not changing at all, which was how you knew he was paying very close attention. Cassian Voss was 61 years old and had been a powerful force in Pack politics for 4 decades. He was not a man who operated on emotion. He was not a man who overlooked details. And he was not a man who was comfortable with anything that fell outside his understanding of how the world was organized. The Alpha King was supposed to be exactly the kind of tool Cassian required: powerful, grief-hardened, uninterested in personal connection, and therefore easily guided by the people around him toward the decisions that served the Council's long-term interests. Not manipulated precisely. Cassian would not have used that word. Guided. Directed. Helped to prioritize the things that mattered. For 4 years, this had worked well enough. Darian governed with absolute authority and iron consistency, but the areas he did not personally focus on, trade agreements, resource allocation, the inner workings of individual pack hierarchies, were left to the council to manage. And the council managed them in the way the council had always managed things, which was in the interest of those who sat on the council. The problem with a grieving king was also the benefit of a grieving king. He did not ask questions he did not care about the answers to. He signed what was placed in front of him if it did not conflict with his direct areas of concern. He lived in a narrowed world, and the people around him had become accustomed to that narrowness, and had built their own operations within it. Eli's hand on the cloak had pulled at something. Cassian could not yet tell what, exactly, but he felt the tension of it. The way you feel a string being pulled, before you can see which direction it's moving. "Is the woman politically connected?" he asked. His aide, a thin man named Gerald, who was exceptionally good at finding things out, shook his head. "No connections. Omega rank. No family above low-class standing. Her mate was a border patrol guard, deceased 3 years ago. She has no ties to any organized faction." "Is she ambitious?" Gerald considered. "There's no evidence of it. By all accounts, she's been focused entirely on survival and the child." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "What does she want?" "That is less clear," Gerald said. "She hasn't asked for anything since the relocation. She works in the administrative kitchen during morning hours. She keeps to herself. The boy attends lessons in the afternoon program. And these visits to the study? The boys, not the woman's. She hasn't sought any contact with the Alpha King. The visits appear to be entirely the child's initiative." Cassian unfolded his hands and refolded them the other way. "The child," he said. "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. A child who had walked up to the most powerful wolf in the kingdom and spoken without fear. A child whose mother had managed to maintain total discretion in a highly visible new situation. A child who was somehow making the Alpha King laugh in a room that had been silent for 4 years. This could be nothing. An unusual set of circumstances producing an unusual outcome, temporary and self-resolving. The king would grow bored, or the novelty would wear off, or the child would say something wrong, and the situation would return to normal. Or it could be something, a lever, a point of vulnerability in a man who had not had a visible one in 4 years. Cassian did not make any decisions that morning. He was not a man who made decisions before he had full information. He told Gerald to continue watching and report anything that changed, and then he thanked him and sent him away and sat alone in his quarters for a while, thinking about the particular danger of unexpected things. On the other side of the grounds, in a corridor that connected the guest wing to the main administrative building, Sarah was walking to her morning shift in the kitchen and being entirely unaware of the conversation that had just concluded about her. This was a form of ignorance she could not afford to maintain indefinitely, but she did not know that yet. She was thinking about the previous evening, when Eli had come home from his lesson with a book tucked under his arm, and a particular brightness about him. The book was on the history of the Northern Territories, which was not standard material for the basic lessons offered to children in the afternoon program. She had looked at the book, and then at Eli, and Eli had said, with the easy confidence of a child who does not understand why the truth needs managing, that the Alpha King had lent it to him. Sarah had taken the book. She had held it for a moment. It was old and well-maintained, the kind of book that was handled carefully and returned promptly, which meant it was valued. She had looked at her son, who was already pulling off his shoes and settling in for an evening of reading, and she had felt the thing inside her chest shift again. The crack that had opened on the night of the assembly, that she had been carefully avoiding putting any weight on, had widened slightly. She had said thank you and told Eli to wash his hands before dinner, and she had gone to the kitchen window and stood with her back to the room for a moment, working out her breathing. It was a book. It was nothing. A loan of a book from a man who clearly had many to spare, to a child who was clearly hungry for them. It was the kind of small, incidental kindness that meant nothing beyond itself. Except that the man in question did not do incidental things. She had learned this from careful observation, from the way his guards moved, from the way his orders were structured, from the account of the assembly that she had pieced together from various sources. Darian Voss did not do anything without intention. Everything he did was a decision, which meant the book was a decision. She was not sure what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she was not sure about. She set it aside and kept moving. In the kitchen that morning, she worked alongside 2 other women, Clara, who was mid-ranking and friendly in the uncomplicated way of people who have not needed to be suspicious, and May, who was older, a retired pack healer who volunteered in the kitchen 2 mornings a week, and who had, in Sarah's experience, the most accurate read of any situation she entered. May did not gossip, which was unusual. She listened, which was rarer. "You're thinking hard," May said, not looking up from the bread she was shaping. "Am I visible?" Sarah said. "To me," May said. "To others, you look like you're making stock." Sarah looked at the stock. She adjusted the heat. "There's a great deal of talk going around," she said neutrally. "There always is," May said. "This particular variety of talk is about you, though, so I expect you have feelings about it." "I have observations," Sarah said. "Not feelings." May made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Observations, then." "People are deciding what this means," Sarah said, "before they know what it is." "People always do," May said. "The question is what it actually is." Sarah was quiet for a while, stirring. "I don't know," she said finally. And the honesty of that surprised her slightly, because she rarely admitted not knowing things, even to herself. May set down her bread and turned to look at Sarah directly, which she did not often do. "The Alpha King," she said, "has not allowed anything or anyone inside his world since Helena passed. Not in 4 years. Not his council, not his guards, not anyone." She paused. "Your boy walked in through the front." Sarah met May's eyes. "Eli doesn't knock," she said. "No," May said. "He doesn't." She turned back to her bread. "That's either a very big problem or the best thing that's happened to that man in 4 years. Possibly both." Sarah thought about that for a long time after May left the kitchen. She thought about it while she finished the stock and cleaned the surfaces, and walked back through the corridor to the guest wing. She thought about it while she passed the door of the administrative study, which was closed and quiet at this hour, and felt the pull of it the way you feel the presence of something significant that you have not yet decided how to approach. She did not slow down as she passed. She kept her pace even, and her eyes forward, and she walked all the way back to their room, and she stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard, where the morning light was doing its almost warm thing, and she let herself think, just briefly, just for a moment, about the possibility that May was right. That it could be both. A very big problem and the best thing that had happened, both at once. She had spent 3 years choosing safety over everything else. Safety was keeping Eli fed and keeping her head down and keeping her expectations close to 0, because 0 was the only number that could not disappoint you. 0 had kept her standing. 0 had kept Eli whole. But 0 had a cost she had been paying for a long time without looking directly at it. And lately, in this place with the locked door and the almost warm light and the borrowed book on Northern Territories that her son was currently reading, with total focus on the floor beside his bed, 0 felt like a different kind of poverty than the one she was used to. She was not ready to want anything. She was not sure she remembered how. But something in the direction of wanting had started to move, and she was paying attention to it, the way she paid attention to everything that mattered, carefully, and from a distance, and without letting it know she was watching. The punishment for Grant Hollis, Pete Corden, and the man called Beryl was delivered 11 days after the assembly, in the formal setting of the Pack Law Hall at the Ashevale Territory boundary. Darian did not attend personally. This was deliberate. His presence would have transformed a legal proceeding into a demonstration of royal power, which would have shifted the focus from accountability to performance. He sent Colin instead, with a full written judgment and a set of terms that left no room for interpretation. The 3 men received sentences that would be served in the Territory Work Program, not out of the territory, not in the capital's formal detention, but inside the very community they had chosen to harm, under mandatory supervision, assigned to work that benefited the Omega households of the lower quarter specifically. This was not the harshest punishment available under Pack law. It was, however, the most targeted. They would spend the next 2 years carrying water, making repairs, and doing the work they had previously forced others to do, in the presence of the people they had forced to do it. When the judgment was read aloud, Grant Hollis had objected. He had said, in a voice that started loudly and became considerably less loud very quickly, that this was disproportionate to the offenses charged. Colin had looked at him with the particular blankness that guards develop when they have been trained never to show what they think, and had replied that the judgment was final, and that any further objections should be directed to the Alpha King in writing, and that he would be happy to provide paper. There were no further objections. The Ashvale pack leader's situation was handled differently and more extensively. His formal censure was accompanied by a 2-year administrative review process, conducted by an external team appointed directly by the royal office. During this period, every resource allocation, complaint filing, and welfare decision in the territory would be reviewed before implementation. It was the structural equivalent of being placed under supervision, not removed, but watched, and knowing you were being watched, which in many ways was the more significant part. Word of both judgments moved through the territories quickly and with mixed reception. Among the lower-ranked Wolves and Omega-class families, the response was something closer to relief than celebration. Relief is quieter than celebration. It does not announce itself in the streets, it happens in private, in the kitchen over the morning bread, in the shared workspaces during an afternoon shift, in the particular way a person's shoulders drop when they exhale after holding tension for a very long time. People who had learned not to expect much from the formal structures of pack justice found themselves adjusting that expectation slightly, tentatively, the way you adjust your footing on ground you have previously found unreliable. Among the mid-ranking and high-ranking Wolves, the reaction was more complex. Many supported the judgment on principle. The abuses had been clear, the inaction of the pack leadership had been embarrassing, and a strong response was reasonable. But there was also unease, and the unease came from the precedent. If the Alpha King was going to personally involve himself in the welfare of Omega-ranked Wolves, what did that mean for the arrangements that had been quietly maintained across the territories for years? The arrangements were not written down anywhere. They did not need to be. They were simply the understood order of things, a layered system in which rank determined access, and access determined everything. An Alpha King who noticed what was happening at the bottom of that layer was an Alpha King who might eventually ask questions about how that layer was maintained. Lord Cassian Voss received a private briefing on the reaction in every territory within the first week of the judgment, and read it with the expression he always wore when reading things that required his attention, still, and slightly tilted to the left, as if one ear were more involved than the other. The territories are unsettled, Gerald reported. Unsettled is correct, Cassian said, but not dangerously so. Not yet. He set down the briefing. The review team appointed to Ashvale. Who selected them? The Alpha King personally. And Colin leads them? Colin leads them. 3 others, all from the Royal Guard's Administrative Division. Cassian nodded slowly. And the complaint process review, the one he assigned Colin to head before that? Still ongoing. Preliminary findings due in 6 weeks. Cassian was quiet for a moment. He's building something, he said. Gerald waited. He does not do things one at a time, Cassian said. He did not come to power by doing things one at a time. The Ashvale judgment, the review, the complaint process examination, these are connected. He is building toward a structural change in how Omega welfare is managed. He paused. This is not about the child. Gerald considered. It began with the child. It began with the child, Cassian agreed. But it does not end there. The child was a catalyst. The king would not restructure welfare systems across multiple territories simply to honor a debt to a 5-year-old. He picked up a pen and set it down again. He has been looking for a reason. The child gave him one. This was a reasonable analysis. It was also, as it happened, not entirely correct, which was the interesting thing about it, and the thing that Cassian would not realize until later. He was right that Darian was building something. He was right that the welfare review was connected to the Ashvale judgment and the complaint process examination. He was right that it was structural. What he did not account for was the possibility that the catalyst and the restructuring were both real simultaneously, that a political mind and a cracked open feeling could coexist in the same person, that a king could begin acting on a long-deferred sense of responsibility because a child's hands on his cloak had reminded him, without any words at all, that responsibility had a face. Darian was sitting in the study with Eli on a Tuesday afternoon when Colin knocked and entered with the preliminary welfare review findings. Eli was at the table in the corner with the book on Northern Territories, which he had now read twice, and was apparently reading for a 3rd time, with an increasingly focused set of questions forming about the eastern trade routes. He looked up when Colin entered, assessed the situation with the efficiency of a child who has learned to read rooms, and returned to his reading. Colin placed the documents on the desk. He noted Eli's presence with the practiced neutrality of a guard who had long since stopped being surprised by things he did not understand. He pointed to 3 key passages in the findings, answered Darian's questions in order and without pause, and waited for further instruction. The most common barrier to complaint filing, Darian said, not looking up from the documents. Fear of retaliation, from whoever the complaint is against, Colin said, which is, in most cases, someone who outranks the person complaining. And the current review structure places the complaint with the pack leader. Correct. Who is also typically allied with, or at minimum acquainted with, the person the complaint is about. Correct. Darian set the documents down. Then the review structure needs to be external. The complaints need to go to someone who has no territorial alliance with either party. He thought for a moment. Set up regional officers, not appointed by pack leaders, appointed directly by the royal office, funded separately from pack resources. Colin wrote this down. He wrote quickly, and without comment, which was one of his better qualities. How long to implement? Darian asked. Realistically, 4 to 6 months to appoint and train, Colin said. Another 3 to begin full operation. Make it 3 to 4 for appointment and training. I'll add it to the spring allocation. Understood. And Colin, Darian said, and something in his voice changed slightly, became slightly less formal, slightly more direct, the way it did when he was saying something he had thought about, rather than something he was managing. This should have been in place before Ashvale. It should have been in place years ago. Colin looked at him. Yes, he said, without any elaboration. Darian nodded. Go. Colin went. In the corner, Eli turned a page of his book. He had not appeared to be paying attention to any of that conversation. He had, in fact, been paying attention to every word, with the particular quality of attention that very bright children develop when they have been taught, by a careful parent, that listening is a skill, and silence is sometimes the best exercise of it. He waited until the door closed. Then he said, without looking up from the book, the regional officers are a good idea. Darian looked at him. Thank you, he said, in a tone that was not entirely without dryness. It makes it so people don't have to be afraid to say something, Eli said. My mother didn't say anything for a long time because she was afraid. Darian was quiet. I know, he said. Eli looked up from the book. She doesn't like to need things, he said. She thinks it makes her less safe if people know she needs things. That's a reasonable concern, Darian said carefully. It used to be, Eli said. He looked at Darian with the simple directness that was starting to feel, to Darian, like the most honest thing in his daily life. Is it still? The question sat in the room. Outside, the wind moved against the window. In the training ground below, someone called a halt to a drill. No, Darian said, not here. Eli held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who has received the answer they expected and finds it acceptable, and returned to his book. Darian returned to his documents, but the word here was sitting in the middle of his chest, in the space between where the walls he had built began and where they ended, and it had arrived there before he had decided to let it. He looked at the word here in his mind. He looked at what it meant, exactly. He had said it without managing it, which was becoming a pattern around this child, and, more quietly, around the child's mother, and he was not sure yet whether to be concerned about that. He filed it the same way he had filed the question in the infirmary, the way he filed everything he was not ready to examine. He set it aside. He would deal with it later. But later was getting closer, and he could feel it, the way you feel a season changing before it has fully arrived. The letter from the eastern border arrived on a morning when the weather had finally decided to commit to cold. The grounds outside the royal guest wing were pale with frost, and the trees at the edge of the courtyard had gone entirely bare, their branches sharp and black against a sky the color of old pewter. Sarah had started waking earlier than the household required, not from anxiety, but from the particular habit of a woman who does not trust warmth to last, and prefers to spend it consciously. She was in the small kitchen making tea, when Nora knocked and handed her an envelope without preamble. Nora was a woman who did not believe in preambles. The envelope was addressed to Eli, in a handwriting that was deliberate and careful. Each letter formed with a kind of precision that suggested the writer was not accustomed to correspondence, and had taken this particular letter seriously. Sarah looked at the envelope for a moment. "Who is it from?" "One of the Border Patrol units," Nora said. "The ones stationed at the eastern fence. They heard about the boy." She paused. Apparently they decided to write. Sarah turned the envelope over. On the back, in smaller writing, was a single line, "For the pup who was brave enough to ask." She set it on the table and looked at it for a while after Nora left. Eli came to breakfast with his hair still disordered from sleep and a book tucked under his arm that he had apparently decided he needed at the table, which was an ongoing negotiation between them. He saw the envelope immediately. He saw everything immediately, which was both wonderful and occasionally exhausting, and looked at her with raised eyebrows. "That came this morning," she said. He sat down and picked it up. He looked at his name on the front. He looked at the line on the back. His expression went through several stages: surprise, pleasure, something that was almost wonder, and then, characteristically, determination. He opened it carefully, in the deliberate way of someone who understands that some things should not be rushed. There were 6 pages inside, different handwritings. The letter was from an entire patrol unit, each man and woman having written their own section. Some were short, a few lines, a simple greeting, a statement of thanks and respect. Some were longer, more personal, written by people who had clearly been working out what they wanted to say for several days. One woman named Kate had written half a page about what it meant to her that someone had finally made the Alpha King pay attention to what was happening in the lower quarters, and how she had grown up in a lower quarter herself, and how she had always thought that the hardest thing about being at the bottom of the pack structure was not the difficulty but the invisibility, and how Eli had, in 4 words, done something about that. Eli read every word. He read slowly and carefully, which was unusual for him. He was normally a fast reader. He read as if each section was a person standing in front of him and deserved his full face. When he finished, he set the letter down on the table and was quiet for a moment. His tea had gone cold. His book had been forgotten. He looked at his mother. "They say I was brave," he said. "You were," she said. "I wasn't," he said. "I was just scared, and scared and brave aren't the same thing." Sarah looked at her son. He was 5 years old, and he had just said something that most adults arrived at through decades of experience, if they arrived at it at all. "Sometimes they are the same thing," she said. "Sometimes being scared and doing it anyway is exactly what brave means." He considered this with the seriousness he applied to things that mattered. "I didn't do it because I was brave," he said. "I did it because I didn't have any other option." "That's also what brave is," she said gently. He thought about that. Then he picked up the letter again and held it, not reading it, just holding it. "I want to write back," he said. "We'll do it after lessons," she said. He nodded. He picked up his tea, remembered it was cold, and pulled a face. She took it and replaced it with a fresh cup without comment, because she had been doing this for 5 years, and it still made her smile internally every single time, and some things were allowed to simply be what they were. She told him to eat his bread, and he ate it, and the morning moved forward. Later that day, after lessons and after the letter-writing project, which took 2 hours and produced a response that was 4 pages long and addressed each section of the original letter individually, Eli went to the study. Sarah had known he would. She had also known, on some level she was only beginning to acknowledge openly, that this would eventually circle back to the Alpha King. She was right, but not in the way she expected. Eli came home that evening and reported, with the natural ease of someone who sees no reason to manage information, that he had shown the letter to the Alpha King, and that the Alpha King had read it, all 6 pages. "And," Sarah said. "He didn't say a lot," Eli said. "He got very still for a while." He paused, searching for the right word. "He looked like you look when you're working something out that you don't want anyone to see you working out." Sarah was quiet for a moment. The similarity in the description registered. "Then he said I should keep it somewhere safe," Eli said. "He said letters like that are the kind of thing you'll want to read again when you're older." Sarah thought about that. She thought about a man reading 6 handwritten pages from Border Patrol wolves who had grown up in lower quarters, alone in a study, with a 5-year-old's letter in his hands. She thought about what it meant to read that kind of letter, after years of governing people whose daily reality you had processed through reports rather than faces. She thought about Darian Voss getting very still. He also asked if you were all right, Eli added, as an afterthought. I said yes. Is that true? Sarah looked at her son. Yes, she said, it's true. Good, Eli said, satisfied, and reached for the bread she had just put on the table. She let him eat. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that the question, whether she was all right, was not information Darian had been lacking. He had guards who reported on the state of the guest wing. He could have sent Nora. He could have checked through any of a dozen official channels. He had asked a 5-year-old at the end of a study visit, in the casual way of someone asking something they have been wanting to ask for a while, and finally allowed themselves. She did not build anything on that observation. She set it down next to the other observations she had been collecting, and looked at the whole arrangement of them from a distance. They were forming a shape. She was not ready to name the shape yet. She refilled Eli's water and told him to wash his hands before the meal was done, and he protested that he had already washed them, and she pointed out that that had been before the bread and the book, and he accepted this logic and went to wash them again, and the evening moved forward in the ordinary way of evenings that contain nothing dramatic but are, in their small and unremarkable way, something close to good. In his study, Darian sat with the fire going lower than it should, and 3 reports on his desk that he had not yet opened. He was looking at the space on the desk where Eli had placed the letter, and he was thinking about Kate's half-page, about the part where she had written about invisibility being the hardest part of being at the bottom. He had read that line 3 times. He had not let his expression change. He was very good at not letting his expression change. But something had happened in the exact interior of him, in the space he had walled off and kept empty for 4 years, that he was finding harder to manage than the expression. He was not sure when he had stopped seeing the people at the bottom of the structure as categories and started seeing them as faces. He suspected it was a gradual thing, the kind of change that happens so slowly you do not notice it until you look back at where you started and find the distance surprising. He suspected, if he was honest with himself, and he was trying to be, lately, with increasing effort, that the change had begun in a courtyard, with a small hand on a dark cloak, and had been moving steadily in one direction ever since. He opened the first report. He read it. He made his notes. He was, as always, thorough and precise. But the letter was still on the desk, folded and held carefully at the corner by a stone paperweight, and he had not moved it. He did not think he was going to move it soon. The first attempt on Eli's life was designed to look exactly like what everyone already knew was a risk in the training environment, an accident. The afternoon program that Eli attended included, for the older children, introductory drills on the practice grounds. Eli was not technically in the age group for these drills. He was 5, and the standard age was 7. But the program instructor, a good-natured man named Owen, had watched Eli observe the older children from the boundary fence with such focused intensity for 3 consecutive weeks that he had eventually walked over and told the boy he could join the observation group as long as he stayed behind the marked line. Eli had stayed behind the marked line for exactly 1 session. After that, Owen had found him inside the boundary with his sleeves rolled up, listening to every instruction with the concentration of someone taking an exam. Owen had no real objection to this. The child was careful, quick, and better at following technical direction than most of the 7-year-olds. He adjusted the groupings to include him, and sent a note to Nora informing her of the change. The note reached Nora. It did not, through an administrative gap that would later be examined very carefully, reach Sarah. 3 weeks after Eli began attending the drills, on a Wednesday afternoon when the frost had returned and the practice ground was firm and cold underfoot, one of the overhead training rigs broke. The rigs were used for agility work, wooden frames with ropes and balance beams suspended at varying heights, designed to develop the coordination and spatial awareness that young wolves would need when their physical abilities fully developed. They were inspected weekly by the grounds maintenance team. The inspection log for that Wednesday showed the rig had been checked 2 days prior and declared sound. The malfunction occurred when Eli was directly underneath the frame. The heavy crossbeam above him gave way at one of its anchor points and came down at an angle. Owen, who was standing 10 feet away and watching a different child, turned at the sound of the anchor crack and moved without thinking. He was a trained adult wolf, and his reflexes were considerably faster than a 5-year-old's. He covered the 10 feet in less time than should have been physically possible, and caught the beam with both arms before it completed its fall. He held it there, arms shaking with the weight, and looked at Eli, who was standing underneath him with his eyes wide and his mouth slightly open, unhurt. "Move," Owen said, with controlled calm. Eli moved. Owen let the beam down in a controlled drop once the boy was clear. The practice ground went very quiet. The other children stood still. Owen set the beam on the ground and straightened up and looked at his hands, and then looked at Eli, who was staring at him with an expression that had just shifted from shock to the particular focused alertness that preceded a great many questions. "Thank you," Eli said. "You're all right," Owen said, which was both a statement and a question. "Yes," Eli said. He looked at the anchor point where the beam had come loose. He looked at the inspection marks on the frame. He looked back at the anchor. "That shouldn't have broken," he said. Owen looked at the anchor too. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It shouldn't have." Nora was informed within the hour. She informed Darian within the hour after that. Darian sent Colin to the practice ground personally, which meant that Colin arrived before the maintenance team had been called, which meant that the anchor point was examined before it could be cleaned, adjusted, or explained away. Colin looked at the anchor for a long time. He took measurements, he took samples. He wrote down what he observed, and he wrote it in the careful, specific language of someone who has been trained to see the difference between wear and deliberate harm. The anchor had not worn through. The material had been compromised at a specific point, the interior of the mount, where the compromise would not be visible from a standard walking inspection, but would spread under weight until the anchor failed. It was the kind of damage that required knowledge of the rig's construction and access to the interior of the mount and time alone with the frame. It was not an accident. Colin brought his findings to Darian that evening. Darian read them without expression. He asked 3 questions. Colin answered all 3. Darian thanked him and told him to keep the investigation quiet and to proceed with absolute discretion, and then he sat alone in his study for a long time after Colin left. He was not frightened. Fear was not generally his first response to threat. His first response was the particular clarity that comes when all the noise in your mind goes quiet, and you are left with only the essential thing, which was, someone had tried to harm a child, Eli specifically, in a way that was meant to look like chance, which meant someone was watching, which meant someone had assessed the situation and concluded that the child was a vulnerability, his vulnerability. He sat with that for a long time. He had known, in the abstract, that his unusual behavior at and after the assembly would generate concern in certain quarters. He had known that Cassian, in particular, would be watching carefully. He had not allowed himself to be concerned about this because he had believed, until this moment, that the primary risk was political, that someone might try to use Sarah or Eli as leverage, or manufacture a difficulty around his relationship with them, or simply wait for him to lose interest and return to expected behavior. He had not fully considered the possibility that someone would try to remove the variable. A child, 5 years old, barefoot in the frost on a Wednesday afternoon, standing under a beam that someone had made sure would fall. The clarity turned into something else, something he had not felt since the night 4 years ago when he had stood in the corridor outside Helena's chamber and been told that the investigation into her passing had been concluded and the result was inconclusive. He had controlled that feeling then. He had turned it into the iron consistency with which he had governed the territories since. He had made something useful out of something terrible. He was less certain, in this moment, of his ability to be useful about it. He made himself breathe. He made himself think in order, the way he had trained himself to think. He made a list in his mind of what he knew, what he suspected, what he needed to find out, and what he needed to do to protect Eli and Sarah while the investigation proceeded. Then he called Nora. Nora arrived looking as she always looked, composed, attentive, ready. He told her what Colin had found. Her expression did not change. Her eyes got slightly more alert, which was her version of significant reaction. Eli is not to be alone outside the guest wing, Darian said. Adjusted guard protocol effective immediately. I want someone I personally trust within eyeline at all times. Understood, Nora said. Sarah is to be informed, he said, and he paused, which was unusual. I'll do it myself. Nora looked at him. When would you like to schedule that? Tonight, he said. She nodded. I'll let her know you're coming. No, he said. Don't. I'd rather tell her without advance preparation. She'll spend the time beforehand, managing what she's going to feel about it. And I need her to hear this clearly first. Nora looked at him for a moment. It was a brief look, the kind that said several things in the span of a second, without saying any of them. Then she said, "All right," and left. Darian stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. Outside, the frost was settling again, and the grounds were empty and still, and the lights of the guest wing were pale yellow in the dark. He had told himself, over and over in the weeks since the assembly, that he did not have an answer to the question of why he had followed Eli, that it had been instinct, or calculation, or some combination of the two that he had not fully sorted out. He had told himself that whatever was shifting inside him was a private thing, something to be managed, something to be filed away for later examination. He could not tell himself that anymore. Someone had put a child in danger because they thought that child mattered to him, which meant they were right, which meant he had already answered the question without admitting he had answered it. He put on his coat and walked down the corridor toward the guest wing, and he was not managing anything. He was simply moving toward the thing that mattered, which was what people did when they had already decided, whether they knew it or not. Sarah opened the door on his second knock. She was in the plain, practical clothes she wore in the evenings. No guards, no administrative context, just a woman who had been putting her son to bed and had not expected a visitor. For 1 second, before she had composed her expression, he saw exactly what she felt about seeing him standing in her doorway. Then the composure arrived, and she stepped back to let him in and said, "Is something wrong?" "Yes," he said. He stepped inside and closed the door. He told her about the anchor point and Colin's findings, and he said every part of it without softening it, because she was not a woman who was served by softened versions of difficult things, and he knew that now, with the kind of certainty that comes from months of careful attention. She listened without moving. Her face was still. Her hands were at her sides and perfectly steady. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Eli doesn't know," she said. "Not yet. I want to tell him," she said. "Of course," he said. She was quiet again. The lamp in the corner cast a low, warm light over the room, and the fire was going in the small hearth, and it was very quiet, and Darian was aware, in a way he had not allowed himself to be fully aware of until this moment, that he was in her space, and she had let him in, and the space was small and warm, and felt nothing like the study, or the council room, or any of the places he inhabited the rest of the time. "Who do you think it was?" she asked. "I have a theory," he said. "I'm not going to state it until I have evidence." She nodded. That made sense to her. She dealt in evidence too, not suspicion. "He's all right," Darian said, and something about his voice in those 3 words was different from anything she had heard from him before. Quieter, more direct, as if he was saying it for himself as much as for her. She looked at him. She let herself look, just for a moment, without the careful management. She saw a man who was not standing in her doorway, because a guard had told him to be there. She saw a man who had come himself, in the evening, in the cold, because he had needed to. "I know," she said. "Thank you." And she said it the way Eli had described she would say it, meaning it all the way through, which was different from the polite kind, and which both of them knew it was. He stayed for 12 minutes. They discussed the adjusted guard protocol and the investigation, and what Eli would be told and how. He said what needed to be said, and she asked what needed to be asked, and the conversation was entirely practical and entirely honest, and neither of them said any of the other things that were in the room with them, because neither of them was ready yet. He left. She closed the door. She stood in the middle of the room and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor. Then she went to check on Eli, who was fast asleep with his book on his chest and one arm thrown over the edge of the bed, in the complete abandon of a child who has absolutely no idea how much the people around him have staked on the simple, irreplaceable fact of his continued safety. She sat on the edge of his bed for a while. She did not allow herself to cry. She was not a woman who gave in to that easily. But she sat there for a long time, and her throat was tight, and her hands were not quite steady, and she let herself feel all of it, just this once, in the privacy of the dark room, before she put it away, and started thinking about what happened next. Because something was happening. It had been happening since the night of the assembly, building slowly and steadily, and she was no longer pretending she did not know what it was. She was just deciding, one day at a time, what she was willing to do about it. The evidence arrived, not gradually, but all at once, the way evidence sometimes does when the right question is finally asked of the right person. It was Gerald who broke. This was not something Cassian had anticipated. Gerald had been in his service for 11 years. He was precise, contained, loyal in the transactional way that professional loyalty works. He served because the arrangement benefited him, and because the consequences of not serving were more significant than the benefits of any alternative. He was not idealistic. He did not have the kind of principles that caused people to suddenly change sides. What he had, as it turned out, was a line, and the incident with the training rig had crossed it. Gerald had known about the plan in general terms. He had known that Cassian was monitoring the situation, and that the situation was considered a problem, and that Cassian had considered various approaches to resolving it. He had, in the abstracted way of someone who processes information without always connecting it to its real-world implications, understood that some form of intervention against the child or the woman was being contemplated. He had not known, until the investigation began and the findings circulated quietly through the administrative staff, that the intervention had been as direct as it was. A compromised anchor above a 5-year-old's head was not abstraction. It was a specific act against a specific child on a specific Wednesday afternoon, and when the reality of it arrived in Gerald's mind with its full weight, something in him shifted in a way that he had not known was possible. He went to Colin. He did not go to anyone else. He did not consider going to anyone else. Colin was the Alpha King's direct investigator, and Colin was known, through a reputation built over 15 years of service, for handling sensitive information with absolute discretion, and for not using it in ways that were not directly related to the investigation at hand. Gerald was not being brave. He was being pragmatic in a new direction. But the information he brought was real, and it was complete, and it was exactly what the investigation needed. He told Colin everything he knew: the monitoring, the discussions, the names of the 2 men Cassian had employed to interfere with the rig, men from outside the grounds, who had been brought in under the cover of a routine maintenance contract, the timeline, the decision process. Colin listened to all of it, and wrote down what needed to be written down, and thanked Gerald with the same measured professionalism with which he thanked everyone for everything, and then went directly to Darian. Darian read the report. He read it once, quickly, and then he set it down on the desk. He had known it was Cassian. He had known it since the night he stood in Sarah's room and told her what Colin had found, when the logic of who benefited from Eli's removal had assembled itself quietly in the back of his mind and pointed in one direction. He had waited for evidence before doing anything with it, because he was a man who waited for evidence, and because acting on suspicion against his own uncle in the absence of proof would have been the kind of act that could destabilize everything he had spent 9 years building. Now he had the proof. He did not shout. He did not pace. He sat at his desk for 15 minutes and thought. In the careful, ordered way he thought about everything, about what needed to happen, and in what order, and what the consequences of each step would be. Then he called a meeting of the full council for the following morning. He did not tell them what the meeting was about. He did not need to. The summons alone was significant enough that every member of the council would spend the night in varying states of alert. He was aware of this. He intended it. Cassian arrived at the meeting in his usual state, composed, slightly elevated in bearing, with the particular confidence of a man who has held a position of power for a long time and has stopped being able to imagine genuinely losing it. He took his seat at the council table and arranged his papers and waited for Darian to begin. Darian laid Gerald's testimony on the table. He laid Colin's investigative findings beside it. He laid the report from the maintenance contractors, obtained through a separate channel that had worked quickly and quietly, and confirmed Gerald's account in every relevant detail, on the other side. He did not make a speech. He did not give Cassian an opportunity to construct a defense. He said, in the flat, quiet voice that everyone in the room recognized as the one that meant the decision had already been made, "These documents will be read into the formal record. You have the right to hear the charges stated, and to respond in writing within 7 days. After that period, judgment will be given." Cassian looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long moment. His expression did not fully collapse, but it shifted. A slight contraction around the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. He was a man who had spent 4 decades being the one who held information about other people, Having information about himself laid out on a table in front of witnesses was a new experience, and he did not manage it as well as he had managed other things. "This is a significant accusation," he said, with controlled precision. "Yes," Darian said. "It is. And it is fully documented." The council was silent. Every person at the table had understood, from the moment the documents appeared, what they were witnessing. Several of them were managing their own responses with varying degrees of success. "Darian," Cassian said, and something in his voice shifted, became less formal, more personal, the voice of an uncle rather than a council member. "You are allowing a personal attachment to drive a political accusation against a man who has served this family and this territory for 40 years. Darian looked at him. He looked at him for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was still flat and quiet. "A child was nearly harmed," he said, "by people you employed, for the purpose of limiting my personal choices. That is not a political matter. It is a fundamental violation of everything this council is supposed to exist to protect." He paused. "And I am not allowing anything. I am acting on evidence. That is what I have always done." Cassian looked at the table. His composure had not fully broken, but it had developed visible cracks that everyone in the room could see. 7 days, Darian said, and the meeting was over. In the hours that followed, the council members dispersed with the quiet efficiency of people who have witnessed something significant and need time to think about what it means for them. Cassian left with Gerald at his shoulder, which was a habit he did not realize had become a liability until too late. Nora found Sarah in the kitchen during her morning shift and told her, in the straightforward way Nora told people things, that the person responsible for the incident on the training ground had been identified and that formal proceedings were underway, and that she should know. Sarah heard this with her hands still and her face still and something behind her eyes that was not still at all. "Is it resolved?" she asked. "It's in process," Nora said. Sarah nodded. "Thank you." She went back to the bread she was making. Her hands moved automatically, pressing, folding, turning, and she let them work while her mind did its own work, which was the processing of the fact that someone had looked at Eli and seen a tool for controlling the Alpha King. Someone had decided that her son's existence was a political problem and had acted on that decision. She thought about that calmly, because calm was the only useful state she had available to her. She thought about what it meant for Eli, and for her, and for the shape of the situation they were now in. And she thought about what she had been avoiding thinking about for weeks, which was the central fact underneath everything else. She had information. She had been collecting it since the day she arrived in the protected housing district. In the careful, patient, invisible way she had collected everything that mattered to her survival over the past 3 years. She listened. She observed. She noticed what other people did not notice because they were not paying the kind of attention that depended on accurate information for its life. She knew things about Cassian's operations in the Ashvale territory that were not in Gerald's testimony. She knew about resource movements, food allocations and labor assignments that went to places other than where they were supposed to go. She knew about the complaint records that had been altered before they reached the pack leader's desk. She knew because she had worked in the administrative kitchen, which was adjacent to the administrative filing room, and because she was quiet enough, and unimportant seeming enough, that people forgot to be discreet around her. She had not known what to do with what she knew, until this moment. Now she knew. She finished the bread. She cleaned her hands. She told Clara she was stepping out for a few minutes, and Clara said of course, and took over the oven without question. Sarah walked out of the kitchen and down the corridor, and through the main administrative hall, and knocked on Colin's office door. Colin looked up when she came in. He had the particular focus of a man in the middle of work, and it sharpened further when he registered who was standing in his doorway. "I have information relevant to your investigation," Sarah said. "I would like to give it to the right person." Colin looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled a blank document from his drawer and picked up his pen. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. She told him everything she knew, in order, from the beginning, with dates where she had them, and approximate timelines where she did not. She spoke clearly and without emotional inflation, the way she spoke about everything that mattered, accurately, thoroughly, without leaving anything out. Colin wrote. He wrote for a long time. When she finished, he looked at what he had written and then at her. "This is significant," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." She stood up. She thanked him. She walked back to the kitchen and picked up where she had left off with the bread. And Clara did not ask any questions, and the morning continued. Later, when Eli came home from his lessons with a drawing he had made of the map on Darian's study wall, copied from memory, remarkably accurate, with small labels in his careful child's handwriting, she sat with him at the table, and admired it, and asked about his day, and helped him with the parts of the eastern border routes he had drawn slightly wrong. She did not tell him where she had been that morning. He would know eventually. She would tell him herself. In the honest and complete way she tried to tell him everything, when the moment was right, and the dust had settled, and the shape of what came next was clearer. For now, she folded the drawing carefully, and helped him put it with the letter from the Border Patrol unit, in the box he had designated for things worth keeping. "Are you all right?" Eli said, with the directness he had inherited from nobody, because it was entirely his own. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. He did a small version of the assessing look. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said, satisfied. She almost laughed. She was getting closer to laughing than she had been in a long time, and she was noticing this. What happened at the council table was still moving through the territories 3 weeks later, in the particular way that significant events move through tightly networked communities. Not the same story in each telling, but the same truth underneath it. His faction had been dissolved. 2 of the 3 council members most closely allied with him had submitted quiet resignations without public explanation, which was itself a form of explanation that everyone understood. The formal proceedings took 6 weeks. They were thorough and extensively documented. The charges were read, the evidence was submitted, the testimony was recorded, and the outcome was delivered in writing by Darian personally, which was not standard. Standard procedure delegated final written judgment to the head of the legal administration, but which Darian had decided was appropriate in this case. The outcome was not a public spectacle. It was not designed to shame. It was designed to be clear, to be on record, and to establish, in language that left no room for interpretation, that the use of a child as a political target was not something that would be tolerated in any form, from any rank, for any reason. The sentence stripped Cassian of his council position, removed his territorial governance authorities, and imposed a structured reduction of his household resources to a level proportional to the damage he had caused in the lower quarter territories over the preceding years, because Sarah's testimony had added a dimension to the case that changed its scope considerably. The resource movements she had identified were not a small matter. They involved multiple territories and extended back further than anyone had realized. When Colin's team finished tracing the full extent of them, the picture that emerged was of a system that had been quietly and methodically redirecting resources away from the lowest-ranked wolves for years, using the complexity of the administrative chain to hide the loss at each level. Darian read the final report from Colin's team on a Friday evening, when the fire in his study was higher than usual, because the cold had come back and settled in for what felt like a permanent arrangement. He read every page. It took a long time. When he finished, he sat very still for a while. Then he did something that surprised even Nora, who was not easily surprised. He asked for Sarah to be brought to the study that evening. Not Eli, Sarah. She arrived 20 minutes later, slightly composed in the careful way she composed herself for unexpected requests, and stood in the doorway of the study and looked at him with that assessing expression, the one Eli had done the impression of, the one that lived on the surface of a much deeper and more complicated set of calculations. "Come in," he said, "please." She came in. She sat in the chair across from the desk, not the one by the fireplace that Eli favored, but the straight-backed one that faced him directly. She folded her hands in her lap. "I wanted to show you this," he said, and he slid the summary of Colin's findings across the desk to her. She picked it up. She read it with the same focused attention she brought to everything important. She turned pages. She read the numbers. She read the territory lists. She set it back down. "That's where it went," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I only saw the piece of it I was close enough to see." "I know," he said. "What you reported was the thread that helped us trace the rest." She looked at her hands. "Eli's map," she said, which seemed like an odd thing to say, but he waited, because he had learned that she connected things in ways that arrived at sense, even if the route was indirect. "He made a map of your study wall from memory," she said. "He had the eastern trade routes slightly wrong, We fixed them at dinner. She looked up. He's going to want to understand all of this eventually. The whole structure, how it works and what broke and how it gets fixed. She paused. He asks about everything. I know, Darian said, and he almost smiled. The real kind. He's going to want to know about Helena, she said. She said it carefully, but she said it, which was the kind of directness he was learning to expect from her. He'll ask me first, because he thinks I know more than I do, and then he'll ask you. Darian looked at her. The fire was lower now, and the room was quieter, and the distance across the desk felt both very present and slightly irrelevant. Helena, he said. Sarah looked at him. She didn't say anything. She was giving him the space that the name took up. She would have liked Eli, he said, and it came out plainly, without management, which was the truest way he had said anything in 4 years. Sarah's expression moved. Not much, just slightly. The composed wall developed the particular softness at the edges that meant something real was happening behind it. Tell me about her, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The request was quiet and genuine, and it was the kind of request that a person only makes when they are treating you like a person who has a past worth knowing. He told her, not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough that the room held something other than the two of them calculating at each other across the space. Enough that by the time he stopped talking, the fire had gone down to coals, and an hour had passed, in the way hours pass when you are not watching them. She did not say she was sorry, in the emptied way people say they are sorry. She said, she sounds like someone who was worth grieving. She was, he said. They sat in the quiet for a moment. You stopped, she said. After. Stopped what? Everything, she said. The parts of you that weren't the king. She was not saying it with judgment. She was saying it as observation. The same way she said everything she had actually thought through. Eli walked back into them. He looked at her. He said nothing. So did you, she said. Let him. She paused. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. She stood up. She thanked him for showing her the report. She moved toward the door, and at the door she stopped, not turning back fully, but enough to say, over her shoulder, he's not the only one who has been walking into those rooms. She left. He stayed at the desk for a long time. The coals in the fireplace went dark. He did not notice. He was thinking about the rooms she meant, not the study, not the guest wing corridors, not any of the physical spaces they had both been moving through for weeks. The other ones, the ones behind the walls he had built, the ones that had been empty for 4 years. They were not empty anymore. He did not know what that meant for what came next. He only knew that it was true, and that true was the place he needed to start. The spring came slowly to the royal grounds, the way spring came to cold places, not in a single arrival but in a series of tentative advances, each one retreating slightly before committing. There were days in late winter that felt like early spring, and then days that felt like deep winter again, and then, gradually, the balance shifted and held, and the frost stayed out of the courtyard, and the trees at the edge of the grounds began putting forward the first, tentative green of new leaves. Eli turned 6 in the second week of spring. He had been, in the months preceding this, clearly and contentedly aware that his birthday was coming, and that spring birthdays were the best kind, as his mother had told him, and he had mentioned this fact to enough people that by the time the actual day arrived, most of the guest wing staff and a reasonable portion of the guard rotation knew about it. Nora organized a small gathering. She would not have described it as a celebration, because Nora did not use words like celebration. She would have described it as a planned and coordinated informal occasion, involving food and appropriate acknowledgement of the milestone. There was cake, which Owen had made himself, because Owen had discovered over the winter that baking was something he was remarkably good at, and that Eli's appreciation of baked goods was enthusiastic and uncomplicated. Darian came. He had not been explicitly invited. The occasion was in the main common area of the guest wing, and his presence there was not a standard part of his routine, and no one had asked him. He simply appeared, in the early afternoon, without his guard column, dressed in a way that was still formal, because he did not really have an informal version of himself, but with slightly less armor about it than usual. He stood in the doorway of the common room and looked at the gathered small group. Owen, Clara, May, Nora, 3 other staff members, Sarah, and Eli, with the expression of a man who is doing something he has decided to do and is not going to second guess. Eli saw him first. Eli always saw things first. He crossed the room with the directness that was purely his own and looked up at Darian and said, "You came." "I did," Darian said. "It's my birthday," Eli said. "I know," Darian said. "Happy birthday." Eli smiled with his whole face. He took Darian's hand, not tentatively, not carefully, but with the same full certainty he had taken the cloak, the grip of someone who has decided and done, and pulled him into the room with the confident expectation of a child who has never once doubted that this person was willing to be pulled. Darian came. He sat at the edge of the gathering the way people sit at the edges of things they are not entirely comfortable in, but have decided to be part of anyway. He ate a piece of Owen's cake, which was excellent, and he said so. He listened to Eli's explanation of the drawing he had made. Another map, more complex than the last. This one incorporating the revised Eastern trade routes, and several notes in Eli's handwriting that were not entirely legible, but were clearly important. He looked at the drawing seriously, the way he looked at everything seriously, and he pointed out 2 additional details that Eli had not known, and that Eli immediately added to the drawing with total focus. Sarah moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who has, incrementally, and over a long time, learned to trust the ground she is standing on. She watched Darian from across the room without hiding that she was watching, because she had largely stopped hiding the things she was willing to let be true. He caught her looking once and did not look away, and neither did she, and the moment lasted about 2 seconds, which is nothing, and also significant in the way that only 2-second moments of actual understanding are significant. After the gathering, when Eli had been swept away by Owen for a promised tour of the storage room where the baking supplies were kept, a promise that had been outstanding for 3 weeks, and that Eli had clearly not forgotten, Sarah and Darian found themselves at the edge of the common room, in the particular quiet of a space that has recently been full of people, and is now mostly empty. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wanted to," he said. And then, after a pause that was the measured kind, not the uncomfortable kind, he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "I am going to ask Colin to formally recommend that the protected housing district become a permanent classification rather than an emergency provision," he said, "with full resource support and equal access to all administrative services. The welfare restructuring will take time, but this part can be done quickly." He paused. "For all the families currently here, not only yours." She looked at him for a moment. "That's the right decision," she said. "I know," he said. "You're telling me," she said, "because you want me to know you're not doing it for us specifically." "I'm telling you," he said, "because I am doing it partly for you specifically, and also because it is the right decision, and those 2 things are not in conflict." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the spring afternoon was holding its warmth past the hour it usually let it go. "Darian," she said. He looked at her when she used his name. It was the first time she had used it without a title attached, and they both registered this. "I stopped waiting," she said, "to find out if this was temporary." He understood what she meant. He understood all of it. The waiting, the careful management, the walls that a woman builds when she has learned not to lean on things that might not hold. He understood it because he had built identical walls with different materials. "And," he said. She held his gaze with the directness she had been giving him since the first moment in the infirmary, the assessment that did not flinch. "And I think it's not," she said. The spring afternoon held its warmth. Somewhere in the storage room at the end of the corridor, Eli was conducting an enthusiastic review of baking supplies and asking Owen questions at a rate that Owen was managing with impressive patience. The grounds outside were green at the edges and getting greener, and the trees had committed at last, and the courtyard was warm, in the way that Sarah had always said spring was warm, like an opening, like something waking up. "No," Darian said, "it's not." There was no announcement, no formal declaration, no sweeping gesture of the kind that stories are often built around because they are easier to describe than the true things, which are smaller and harder and more real. There was only 2 people standing at the edge of an empty room in the afternoon light, having said what needed to be said after a very long time of circling it. Later, when Eli came thundering back down the corridor with flour on his sleeve and a detailed plan for the cake he wanted Owen to teach him to bake himself, he found them still in the common room. He looked at them both. He did the small, assessing look, the one that had started all of this on a night in the lower quarter when he had gone out barefoot into the dark and grabbed hold of the one thing large enough to stop what was happening. He looked satisfied. Not surprised, satisfied, like someone who has waited for the right answer and found it exactly where he expected. "Owen says I can come back next week," he said, to Darian. "Can I?" "Yes," Darian said. Eli nodded. He turned to his mother. "You have flour on your sleeve," he said. She looked at her sleeve. She did not have flour on her sleeve. She looked at Eli. He grinned. She almost laughed. She caught it just barely. The sound that came out of her was small and involuntary and entirely real, and Darian heard it, and the expression that crossed his face when he heard it was the kind of expression that should not have surprised anyone, but that everyone who later tried to describe it found difficult to put into adequate words. It was simply the expression of a man who was no longer lost. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom did not change overnight. Change of the real, lasting kind never happens overnight. It happens the way spring happens, in tentative advances, in retreats and returns, in the gradual accumulation of small, irrevocable shifts, until one morning, you look at the trees, and they are fully green, and you cannot quite remember when that happened. The welfare restructuring moved forward. Collins' regional officer program was in its third month of implementation, and the early results were being compiled by a team that reported directly to the royal office rather than through the council chain, which was the point. The numbers were striking. Not because things had improved dramatically yet, the machinery of change was still warm, not yet fully operational, but because the number of complaints now being filed, compared to the number filed in the same period 2 years prior, showed a gap so wide that it was, on its own, a kind of evidence. People had not been silent because nothing was wrong. They had been silent because speaking had not felt safe. It felt safer now. The Ashvale territory was in its 6th month of administrative review, and the pack leader, a man named Grove who had survived the review by demonstrating, convincingly if not elegantly, that his failure had been more negligence than conspiracy, had implemented 6 of the 8 structural changes recommended by the review team, with a promptness that suggested he understood clearly what failure to implement would mean. The lower quarter of Ashvale had a new warden, appointed by the regional officer system rather than by Grove himself. The warden's name was Kate, the same Kate who had written half a page in Eli's letter about invisibility. Eli had been told about this appointment by Darian, in the study, on a Tuesday morning. He had been very still for a moment, an unusual state for him, and then he had said, quietly and with total sincerity, "That's perfect." And then he had gone back to the map he was working on, which now covered most of the table and included the Western territories as well, because he had decided the eastern trade routes connected to the western ones in ways the existing maps did not adequately represent, and he wanted to see if he was right. He was right, as it turned out. Colin confirmed it after reviewing the trade data. Darian had looked at Eli's map, and then at Colin's data summary, and then at Eli for a long moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I thought about it," Eli said simply. Darian had taken the map. He had it placed on the wall of the study, next to the official maps, and 3 members of the trade administration had come to look at it, and had left each time with expressions that suggested they were going to be having conversations they had not planned on. Sarah watched all of this from her own position, which had shifted considerably over the spring, without dramatic announcement. She was no longer in the guest wing kitchen in the mornings. She was working with the administrative team that managed the regional officer program's documentation, accurate, organized, capable of holding large amounts of complex information in her head and representing it clearly, which were qualities that had apparently been visible to enough people over enough months, that the offer had been made through a formal channel and accepted. She had said yes, simply. She did not overthink yes when yes was the right answer. The work was good, not exciting in the way that adventure is exciting, but satisfying in the way that repair work is satisfying, when the thing being repaired is something that should have been working all along, and finally is. She was good at it. She was better at it than she had known she would be, which was itself a small revelation, that competence could exist in directions you had not yet been given a chance to go. May told her, on a morning in early summer when they were both in the kitchen at the same time for different reasons, that she looked different. "Different how?" Sarah said. "Like you've put down something heavy," May said. "You were carrying it so long you forgot it wasn't supposed to be there." Sarah thought about that. I think I've been putting it down in pieces, she said. Over a long time. The best things work that way, May said. All at once is too much to manage. Sarah looked at her. You knew, she said, not accusing, just noting. May made a sound that was the very close neighbor of a laugh. I know a great many things I don't say, she said. It is, as your son would tell you, the most useful kind of knowledge. Darian had, in the spring and into the summer, stopped filing things away for later. He had realized, somewhere in the course of the season, that later had arrived. That the act of continuing to defer what was real was itself a choice, and not the kind he wanted to keep making. He had not become a different person. He was still precise, still deliberate, still the kind of man who thought before he spoke, and thought again before he acted. But something had opened in him that allowed the thinking to include more than calculation. It included, now, the things that were true, whether they were useful or not. The sound of Eli's questions in the morning. The quality of Sarah's silence when she was working something out. The specific gravity of an afternoon, in the study that contained a child doing cartography on the floor, and a woman reviewing documents in the chair by the window, and a fire that someone had thought to keep going. He was aware that this was happiness. He had not felt it in long enough that the recognition took a moment, but he recognized it. He was also aware that it was not uncomplicated. The territories were watching. The council, reshaped now with new members who were more carefully selected, was not universally comfortable with the direction things were moving. There would be continued resistance to the welfare restructuring from those who benefited from the current arrangements. There would be political calculations made by pack leaders about what Sarah's position meant, and what Eli's presence meant, and what the Alpha King's changed behavior meant for their own alliances. He had been a king long enough to know that good things and complicated things were usually the same things. He managed it. He managed all of it. That was what he did, and he did it well, and the doing was no longer the only thing. On a Saturday in late summer, Eli organized what he called an expedition to the eastern edge of the grounds, where the border of the royal property met the beginning of the open land before the next territory. He had been planning this expedition for 2 weeks, and the plan included Darian, Sarah, Owen, and a packed lunch, and it had the quality of a plan made by someone who assumes everyone will say yes, because the idea is clearly good. They all said yes. The walk took an hour. Eli walked ahead for most of it, at the pace of a child who is always slightly ahead of the available information, turning back periodically to say things he had noticed about the terrain, or ask things about the history of the landmarkers. Owen answered the natural history questions. Darian answered the territory questions. Sarah walked with the easy pace of a woman who has stopped hurrying everywhere, and occasionally she and Darian walked at the same speed, which was close, and did not require any particular commentary. At the edge of the grounds, where the land opened up and the summer grass ran out toward the distant tree line, Eli stopped and put his hands on his hips and looked out at all of it with the expression of someone completing a mission and finding the destination satisfactory. The eastern trade routes connect here, he said, to no one in particular. You can see it. The land is lower on the right side, which is why the old routes went south instead of straight. Owen looked. You can actually see that, he said, impressed. Eli nodded with satisfaction. I was right. He looked at Darian. Darian looked at the land, and then at the boy, and said, You were. Eli grinned. He sat down in the grass with the complete comfort of a person who has no difficulty simply being where he is, and opened the lunch that Owen had packed, and began distributing it with a 6-year-old's sense of fairness, which was thorough if not perfectly proportional. Sarah sat beside Eli. Darian sat on the other side, which placed him beside Sarah, which was where he had been, in one form or another, for most of the summer, without either of them making any formal declaration about it. They ate. Eli talked. Owen contributed. The afternoon was warm and undemanding, and the grass was the full, deep green of late summer, and the tree line in the distance was soft with heat, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only happens when a season is fully committed to what it is. At one point, Eli put his hand on Darian's arm, in the companionable way he had developed over months of study visits and expeditions and Tuesday mornings. He was pointing at something on the horizon and asking about it, and the hand on the arm was simply the gesture of someone who is comfortable, who is at home, who has found the thing he ran toward in the dark on a cold night, and is now sitting beside it in the warm summer afternoon. Darian felt the small hand on his arm, and did not manage his response to it. He just let it be what it was, which was everything. Sarah watched them both. She looked at her son with the particular love of a woman who has spent 3 years being afraid of the future, and has arrived, somehow, at a present she did not dare imagine. She looked at the man beside him, who had been hardened by loss into something very still, and very strong, and very closed, and had been opened again, not by anything dramatic or orchestrated, but by the most honest thing in the world. A child, with no shoes, and no fear, and nothing left to lose, who grabbed what was in front of him, and held on. She looked at both of them, and she was grateful, in the full and unguarded way, the way you are grateful when you have stopped rationing it. The afternoon held. No one in the territories would have described what happened at the assembly as a beginning. They would have described it as an incident, an event, a moment. The barefoot boy with the grabbed cloak, the 4 words, the Alpha King who followed. But every beginning looks like something else from the outside. It is only from the inside, from the middle of it, that you know what you are actually in. Sarah knew. Eli had always known. And Darian, who had spent 4 years learning to exist, without knowing things he had previously taken for granted, the weight of a full morning, the specific comfort of a warm room that belongs to you, the unremarkable grace of an afternoon that is simply good, Darian knew too. He looked out at the eastern land, at the natural corridor that Eli's careful cartography had mapped and confirmed, at the old routes made visible by the slope of the earth, at the distance that had always been there but had required someone to see it clearly before anyone could use it. He thought about that. Then he looked at the 6-year-old beside him, who was now lying flat in the grass with his arms out, looking up at the sky, with the complete contentment of someone who has done what he came to do, and found it good. "What are you doing?" Darian asked. "Resting," Eli said, without any apology. "From what?" "From everything I had to figure out," Eli said. "I think I figured most of it out now." Darian looked at him. "Have you?" "Yes," Eli said. "It mostly worked out." A sound came out of Darian. It was not short and involuntary like the first time. It was longer, and easier, and it had warmth in it, and he did not stop it, or manage it, or file it away. He just laughed. Sarah looked at him. She saw his face in the act of it, fully, without any of the management, and that was the most remarkable thing she had seen yet, because it was the face of a man who was present, entirely and without qualification, in the middle of his own life. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The afternoon held them all, and the grass was warm, and the sky was blue all the way to the edges, and somewhere in the direction of the royal grounds, the trees at the courtyard edge were full and green and absolutely committed to the season they were in. It had begun, in the end, with the most ordinary and extraordinary thing, a small hand, and 4 honest words, and a man who stopped walking long enough to hear them. Everything worth having starts somewhere like that. In a moment too small to see from the outside. In a grip that refuses to let go.